So it's always interesting for me as someone that's quite nomadic, that travels to lots of different groups that are, you know, prototyping different ways of organizing, that are trying to do something radical. It's always interesting to encounter a new group and see what structure is provided, like what are the norms, what are the rules. And at the Solarpunk gathering, I got to the hub and have that slightly disorienting, like, oh, who are these people? What are we doing here? And one of the first things that I think it was Felix explained to the whole group was, okay, this is a space that's really co-created. We're co-responsible. This is not a hotel. We're all going to take care of the place together. And what we've learned from doing this a bunch of times is that having a completely open-ended lack of structure probably will result in the tragedy of the commons, and the place is going to be a mess. And so we're gonna kind of impose the structure on you, which says there's a kitchen crew, there's a cleaning crew, there's a documentation crew, there's, you know, you kind of listed off just these like extreme, like wafer thin kind of brackets around people's freedom, and said those things exist. We need you to cluster into those 5 groups or 6 groups or whatever it was. And then once you've assigned yourself to kitchen crew or documentation crew, whatever, then you figure out as a group, what is the responsibility? What are you going to do with it? And I thought that was really elegant. It was like, I've had really bad experiences in like squats and anarchist collectives and stuff where there's just like a complete absence of structure, which in my experience it mostly leaves most people not really contributing significantly. People feel awkward, or they just don't know how to play the game. Or else you go into these other groups that are more like authoritarian, I guess. They're more like, there's a policy for everything, and we're going to really rigidly establish the rules, and then everything, all your expectations will be clear, and we've thought ahead about everything. And this was just like a tiny step in the direction of structure, but just enough to allow plenty of freedom, but still that, you know, the house was clean, the dishes got done. So I thought that was a really elegant and inspiring example for me. I'm someone who tends to go too hard on the structure, so it was great to see like you can just have this tiny little sprinkle of structure, and that might be all you need to catalyze the self-organization. But it's got to be
Yeah.
more than zero.
Yeah. I think because the Solarpunk Now event is I think maybe 5th or 6th event they've done so far. I think they've gotten better at improving kind of like what type of structures work and what don't work. In the very first CCG, I think we were lucky in that everyone, or a lot of people, were really into the idea of the commons anyways. We had a lot of people from like the Common Stack and those types of projects that worked really closely with Felix. So they knew at least conceptually like Ostrom's principles, you know, and things like that. So it wasn't so bad, but there was definitely like there were certain points where things got a little bit messy, but it was overall definitely bearable. I've been in much worse situations. But yeah, I think they've done a really good job now of being able to, I guess like you described, like create just like the minimal amount of structure that motivates people enough who are there for a reason and for a purpose to be able to do the work that they feel like is important, rather than having to have like super strong, strict responsibilities for everyone and they lose points if they don't do it or something like that.
Yeah, I mean this kind of captures one of the conclusions of the last like decade of my work, which is like it's great if you want to get rid of the hierarchy. Like I think hierarchies tend to be like really bad as a rule of thumb, but also hierarchies exist for a reason. And so if you're going to get rid of the hierarchy, you have to replace it with something. And that's like a long, slow lesson to really grasp, that like just kind of wiping the slate clean, as it were, is not sufficient. Like there has to be some kind of operating principles, or yeah, like Ostrom's principles. There's got to be some sanctions for people that are spoiling the commons. Like there's got to be some kind of mechanisms in place that do the things that hierarchy does, but in a way that's much more liberating and much more just. Yeah, that's the lesson that I've just had to like keep coming up against and against again and again for the last like 10 years.
And did you have any thoughts about like the facilitation process from an organizational perspective? Did you feel like, I don't know, were you impressed, or were you saw some things lacking, and like, or like people falling into like the same traps that maybe you observe in your work?
Mm, mm. It's hard to me. It's hard for me to answer that fairly because I'm a facilitator and I'm extremely opinionated about how groups run. Um, Anything that's not done. So one of my kind of like complexes, I guess, is that I sometimes mistake variation for error.
Mhm.
So people people do things differently, and there's a part of me that thinks, oh,
Right.
that must be wrong. There must be something failing here. So there's lots of stuff. If it was my event that I would do differently, but as a result, it would appeal to a different group of people and I get a different outcome. So, like for example, I would put more energy into like intentionally breaking cliques and sort of nudging, almost forcing people to form new
Right.
relationships. Because I'm the kind of awkward person who, yeah, it's not really easy for me to like if I see a cluster of people that all seem to know each other and have their in jokes and everything, it's pretty hard to like bust into
Right.
that. So I would design kind of facilitation processes that really intentionally just create different clusters that give you an excuse to start a conversation with someone new that you might be feeling a little intimidated around. Or yeah,
Yeah.
there's something about people who know each other well when they have that sense of closeness. It can be intimidating to people who don't know them or feel like an outsider, and it can create this kind of like separation and social anxiety and stuff. And so like I put a lot of energy into busting through that. But then maybe that's only appealing to a certain kind of person who wants to have their hand held, and other people would be like, "Oh, get out of the way, man! Why are you trying to, meddle with everything? Like, just let us be adults." So that's what I mean. It's just a different thing that I
Yeah,
would do.
that's fair. I think that's because you did this session in the beginning of the event that I thought that was really nice. Just kind of getting people to, I guess, come out of their shells a little bit and just talk about the things that, yeah, how they're feeling that day, since it was just the beginning. And yeah, I know that since I'm someone who's been to so many of these events, I'm like very comfortable in this space, but I could probably do more to get other people to also feel comfortable and like give them the lay of the land, or like the, yeah, if I just share stories about the space or like what's happened before, I think gives people just context about how things are generally done and what the expectations are, and how weird they can get or not. I think it helps.
Yeah, yeah. And making introductions is really helpful too. So like as someone who knows a few of the people that are already there, it's like, oh, you should talk to this person about this topic, and just creating that kind of handhold to get the conversation started. Like I say, ideally we'd all be adults sufficiently confident to just like muddle our way through a new group. But my experience is that there's a lot of inhibitions at the start of a group process. And if we can kind of accelerate through them, then we just get more
Yeah.
done. And I think this applies to any event, any new group, any new configuration of people coming together. Like some people are going to have, or maybe even most people are going to have some hang-ups about like, do I fit here? Do people like me? Do I have a role to play? What's expected of me? There's all these kind of uncertainties, and they can either be just like a little bump, and we need some icebreakers or whatever to like warm up, or they can compound into these anxieties that like really inhibit
Hmm.
the flow. This is the result of being obsessive about vibes, for a decade. So I don't know if this applies to everyone or it's just me being a weirdo.
Talking about from I think that's a great jumping off point. So for the audience, I'm speaking to Richard Bartlett, and Richard, I followed you, I think, for a while now, and just like, I think you're the first person that I've come across as like really digging into the sort of nuances of organization, in like both in like small groups in ways that are like kind of constructive and not like, I don't know. Sometimes people, when they talk about organization, then go to weird places. But I like a lot of the things that you've written about. I followed your work regarding like Enspiral and Loomio, which I both think are like incredible organizations that a lot of people should know more about. And I know that recently you've been working on this project that you call Microsolidarity. But maybe, to get into that, if you want, could you share us your story? How did you get to this point that you're at now? And yeah, what is Microsolidarity and all these things?
Okay, I have a bad habit of taking an hour to tell my story, but I'll try and condense it usefully. So my grandparents are European. I grew up in New Zealand, so like I'm part of the settler class. I was raised in this like Christian community, which when I left in my early 20s, like I left behind the the kind of metaphysics of Christianity and the story about God and sin and hell and everything. I was quite happy to leave that behind, but what I was sad to leave behind was the solidarity in the community that I grew up in. Solidarity being like, this is a group of people that can organize to buy a big community building, or to organize a school, or to like cover someone's rent if they lose their job, or like bring them meals when they've had a baby. Like all of those kinds of practical levels of solidarity that I took for granted as a kid in this Christian community. Turns out they're quite rare these days in a lot of the world, and those are the things that now I'm really interested in recreating and finding ways to kind of bootstrap that level of mutual care in fresh communities without needing the religious dimension. I think those two things can, well, I don't know, I hope those things can be decoupled. So yeah, I come from this Christian background and then left my like small town, small church, went to the big city, got an engineering degree, graduated in 2008. Then we had the financial collapse and I like lost my first job and then entered
Great
the void,
timing,
you know,
yeah.
just like, yeah, yeah, yeah. I really like, I felt like a bit like the roadrunner coming off the cliff, you know, just like, what? I spent all of this time like learning and studying and doing what was expected of me and being good and obedient. And then I felt like I came out the end of the whole education system and there was no place for my skills, my talents, my desires. And so I really went into like quite a lost and confused phase. And thankfully, I was embraced by some punks in Wellington, in New Zealand, where I'm from. Um, and because I was hanging out with punks, they kind of gave me an excuse, I guess, to join in with the Occupy movement when that started. And, you know, it started in September 2011 in New York City and then made it all the way around to New Zealand in October 15th, I think, and in 2011. And like, I didn't have prior experience with activism. Like, I didn't have any political consciousness besides having read a few Adbusters magazines and being a bit dismayed by the state of the world, but I didn't have any like theoretical formulations or ideologies that I was committed to. And so Occupy was this completely mind-blowing, can't even really describe how profound the impact was on me because of this coupling between the local and the global. So the local was a very deliberate direct democracy process, quite laborious consensus meetings, but I say laborious, but they're also like quite transformative to go through this process of genuinely listening to the people in this emergent community and understanding their perspectives and needs, and like not just overriding them because I'm smarter or more confident or think I'm cooler, you know, like, no, I actually have to listen and try and come to an agreement with you. Wow, that's hard. Um, and so there's a coupling between the local, which was this very deliberate process, and then the global, which was completely decentralized swarm of activity where there was no formal coordination structure. And yet probably all of the Occupy camps had a very systematic alignment between them, very similar values and practices, very similar experiences, very similar kind of conflicts that they had to deal with. It was like pretty much every Occupy camp either got stomped by the police or it got stomped internally from its inability to govern. Like, just it was amazing to witness like this level of integration and coherence happening despite there being no formal structure of coordination between them. And so both of those aspects really like completely changed my expectations about what people are capable of, and what organizations could be like. You know, that we can become a collective identity with a huge amount of capacity and resources without needing a hierarchy, without even really needing a plan. You know, that we can become a kind of superorganism that has agency and boundaries and needs and desires and demands and things without anyone really calling the shots. Like, that was really fantastic to encounter. And so from Occupy, as that wave sort of crashed, my friends and I got involved with a project called Loomio, which is a software tool, basically just trying to do, hey, we liked doing consensus decision making at Occupy, but it was pretty laborious. If we put it online, could we do it more efficiently? You know, could we have more inclusion for less time? And the software was interesting, but what was much more interesting to me was the team. Like, how do you build an organization that's coming from these values around non-hierarchical organization, inclusion, deliberation, anti-capitalism. Like, can you build a company that's an anti-capitalist company? I don't know. Let's try and figure that out. So um, that's been just a huge amount of fun for me. Like that was a real sort of coming of age process, I guess, to not just have some ideas about how society should be different, but to actually start to implement it with a team and with a budget and, with a mission. And then, I mean, the reason that Loomio succeeded, and I say succeeded because it's still running and
Right.
there's still, hundreds of thousands of groups that use it to
Yeah, we use it for the social.coop like Mastodon instance that I'm in. I know. And like a lot of these platform cooperative groups use Loomio quite a bit.
Great. So when we started Loomio, it was not a novel idea. Like there were dozens of conversations happening. And if you go and search the Reddit archives from 2011, you'll see dozens of different conversations about people saying the same thing. Like we need to have the Occupy General Assembly, but on the computer. Like, and lots of people had that idea simultaneously. And why did Loomio succeed, but all the other ones failed? It's not because I'm brilliant or my co-op's brilliant. It's because we were incubated in the right context. And in our case, the right context was this community called Enspiral. And Enspiral is quite a peculiar network of like activists and business people trying to use the tools of business to do something radically different, trying to solve existential problems in the world, trying to really do something meaningful. And they provided us with first just like a co-working space, like, hey, you've got a new idea. We can't build it for you, but we can give you an office and we can introduce you to people and we can give you an informal kind of training and like project management and how do you build software and how do you test it and how do you make sure it's useful, and oh, you need funders, like who we can introduce you to, and you need legal structures. Like they gave us a lot of connections and introductions. And probably more importantly, they gave us the emotional solidarity. They're like, hey, this is really hard and I want to quit. And having a peer that's like alongside me saying, yeah, I know it's hard and I'm going to help you, but don't quit. Like this is important. Like I think that's why Loomio succeeded 10 years later when everything else expired. It was just like having that amazing support network around us. And I mean, I can talk at length about how awesome Enspiral is, but the thing is, it only works because it's small, like it's less than 200 people. And therefore, we've got a very high level of trust. And people are willing to do a lot to support each other because of this like bounded network of trust. And so this brings us to Microsolidarity, which is a sort of an answer to the question, how do we have many more Enspirals? Like what's a sort of template or a formula or a roadmap for starting very high trust mutual aid communities that really make a difference to people's life? That's the Microsolidarity project, and now we've got a global network with a few dozen communities around the world that are, learning how do you actually bootstrap these mutual aid relationships in a sustainable way, with accountability, with good structures, that's efficient, that's not too annoying, that doesn't get bogged down in shitty conflict. Like, how do you do that? Well, it turns out it's quite hard, but we've been doing it for a few years, and we're like learning together. That's the main thing. It's like an R&D project where everyone's learning together how to do that.
Yeah, I think if I could like crudely summarize Enspiral from what I understand, I read the Enspiral book, Build Together Better, I think is what it's called. Better work together. Gosh,
better work together.
I keep getting it mixed up with like that for some reason. Joe Biden has come up with like this slogan that's like infected my brain, and there's like other projects.
I like it.
But anyways, it's a really good book to learn about the history of Enspiral, I guess, and the sort of practices that are done in the group, written by several different people that were part of Enspiral. I think you have like maybe one or two passages in there, but it's a really interesting book if people want to check it out. But essentially, it sounded to me kind of like a very large group of kind of freelancers, of mostly young people, and sort of a group that provides the support, maybe some of the space for you to pursue the crazy ideas that you may have, but in an environment where maybe you can learn what actual skills you need to try and get to that point from others who are maybe part of that group. And I guess provide it sort of say focuses on the, I guess what you say, like the emotional type of support that you may need, or like the social support that you may need. I think people sometimes will think that, oh, I want to pursue this project, and they take it as like it's like a very alienated journey where like they're kind of like hunkered down by themselves, like working really hard, and that's like the only way to get stuff done is to do that. But it's sort of an acknowledgement that, hey, there are other types of needs that need to be met that aren't just about like hustle culture, I guess, if I could summarize it very quickly. And it's been successful in building things like Loomio, which from my, I mean, you say that I'm fascinated that there were other ideas similar, but Loomio is like one of the only platforms that I've seen that has like active kind of like meaningful democratic expression, I guess, built into the platform compared to, I mean, you don't get this on like a Facebook group, there's like, or subreddit. And I just, from my own experience of running online communities, like I'm de facto like a benevolent dictator of each group that I start, because there are no other tools to facilitate any sort of democratic process. And I think that's done at like I think there are legal reasons for that. Like it's easier for Facebook to be like, oh, this guy is a problem, shut him down, and makes it easier for them. But Loomio takes a very different approach, which I like.
Yeah, and because of the experience at Occupy and then at Enspiral, it seemed obvious, like, oh, it's so much better when we have democratic decision making, when people are involved, where they get to have a meaningful say in like, what are we doing? Are we making money? Okay, we made money. What are we doing with the profits? Like when people are enrolled in that process, it's just obvious that things go better. And what's been kind of surprising and disappointing for me is finding that there's not as much demand for democratic decision making as I had hoped. You know, that actually, for lots of reasons, people don't always want to take responsibility for the groups that they're in, and often they want to delegate and say like, oh, can you just run it and I'll show up, you know, once a month and do my thing. So yeah, it turns out that I thought if we just build the tool, then we'll see this like renaissance of democratic decision making, but it didn't quite go as smoothly.
I think it's a thing where you kind of have to at the point where we have to make the market type of thing. You have to make the market for people who want to do democratic decision making. That requires like people to acknowledge and recognize the importance of that and like the problems with the current way, and which is not an easy task, of course. There's no platform to fix that one.
And like in some cases you have to invent, when you're inventing a market, maybe it's like Airbnb or something, where you're at least, it's like people are already buying short-term vacation accommodation that already exists, and you're just trying to create a new marketplace where buyers and sellers can meet. But for us, it's like we're actually trying to participate in a paradigm shift from a way of relating to each other basically structured around domination and hierarchies to a way of relating where we're no longer in this like parent-child dynamic, but more adult to adult. Like everyone's voice is important, everyone's enrolled, everyone has a say. Like that's a really significant shift. That's much bigger than just like changing the tools that we use. It's like changing how we think of ourselves as agents in the world, and changing almost like how we do culture, how do you raise kids, how do you do schooling, how do you run organizations in that way. Like it's a paradigm shift. So one little piece of software is not going to achieve that. It's more like now I look back and I think Loomio is like a surfboard trying to catch the wave of this transformation coming, but we're not responsible for building the wave. Right.
But yeah, so like I imagine, so all of this work around like thinking about organization in a decentralized way and non-hierarchical way, well before DAOs are really ever much of a thing. I'm assuming that the sort of explosion of DAOs caught your interest a bit, and to me, it's really interesting to see this kind of like interactions between people like you or others in the cooperative space and like people who are really interested in DAOs who have like a very, I mean, no offense, but like naive idea about like organization a lot of the time. But I'm curious, how did crypto come into it for you? Because I know you've had some spicy takes over the couple of years about it.
I keep changing my perspective on this. Like I've been quite antagonistic in the past. I don't know. We'll see what I say. I don't know how antagonistic I am at the moment. I got into it because there was the Holochain crowdfunding campaign, and I heard about Holochain and I was like, well, that makes a lot of sense to me. This like whole agent-centric model makes a lot of sense. I've also got friends working on Scuttlebutt, which is another agent-centric, like decentralized communication protocol. And I just really buy that argument. I don't know if they're going to deliver or not, but during the crowdfunding campaign, I was like, yes, this is a thing that needs to exist. So I contributed to that crowdfunding campaign thinking it was a donation. And then some X number of years later, randomly looked in my crypto wallet and found that my like small donation had turned into like this massive windfall profit. It's like, what the? Okay. So like a lot of people, I think I got properly interested in crypto because of the outsized returns, financial returns from gambling. Like that was just a random,
Right.
yeah, there was no intention behind that. That just randomly happened. But suddenly finding like, wow, this is a big chunk of change that I've never had before. What else is going on? You know, it was like it purchased my attention. And I found when I got into it, like that there are, I think, probably a minority, but a really important minority of projects in the landscape that are really genuine and doing good stuff and really have, I think that they have a grown-up understanding of the challenges of the world and like have a set of ethics to guide them and like meaningful accountability structures and all that sort of stuff is in place. But the majority is not that at all. You know, the majority is a landscape of, on the one hand, you've got the scams and the hype artists, but on the other side, you've got, I think you said naive, you know, like this kind of wishful thinking about how organizations could be different. And honestly, I think that's what the received definition of what a DAO is. A DAO is a blank canvas, an empty container where people can project all of their wishes about how organizations could be different, which is a good thing to have. Like it's useful to have that terminology. It just doesn't tell you what to do.
Right.
It's nice to be able to have a kind of rallying point for people to get behind, but it doesn't actually give you any suggestions about what's needed. And the experience for me that's been quite frustrating and confusing is, on the one hand, a lot of people in the crypto ecosystem welcoming me with a lot of enthusiasm because they know that I've been doing pre-blockchain DAOs, you know, for more than 10 years. And they invite me to give talks and things. And I say, well, this is what you got to do. And everyone's smiling and nodding. But at the end of the session, it's clear that none of them are actually going to implement what I've got to say, because what I've got to say challenges the fundamental premise of, oh, we can solve all of the difficult problems of being a human by designing the right protocol. It's like, no, it doesn't work that way. The way to organize at small scale is like you need systems for building, maintaining, and repairing trust. And that's like a very squishy, very emotional process, and it can't be bypassed by designing the right protocol. Or maybe it can in the distant future, but in the foreseeable future, we're going to have to do it the squishy way. And that's just my conclusion from having figured it out from doing it with a bunch of people. It's not coming from an ideological posture. And yeah, a lot of people that are building DAOs don't want to hear that. So it puts me in an awkward position. And these days I mostly ignore it.
Yeah, fair. I think because I think a lot of the naivety may come from just like the original, I mean, libertarian kind of roots that it comes from, of just like making this essentially automated company. But people have, like you say, like DAOs have just become, instead, DAO has become just catch-all term for like how people would like to see the world in as far as organization goes. And like someone who says like they want everything to turn into DAOs, they're imagining more of a feeling. They're projecting a feeling of how they want everything to be like. But I think because like we don't practice in our everyday lives like decentralized or democratic or autonomous organizing in the first place, like all we have is a feeling. We know that there's something missing and something needs to fill that. DAOs feel like something that can fill that, although what's inside of that is up in the air, up for grabs, I think.
Yeah. And I want to say as well, like I described the position as being naive, but I actually have a lot of respect for being naive. Like I think naivety is a necessary precondition of having breakthrough creative thoughts. So like, awesome, go for it. And be like absurdly ambitious. And some people will actually have breakthrough success with that. But it's kind of annoying being the grumpy old uncle in the corner, like, okay, I went through that phase and now I'm ready for the next bit where we get down into the details. So I don't want to shit on people. Sure. Like people that have agency and they're doing stuff, like they have my full support. It's just sometimes I feel like there's a bit of a mismatch between where people are at and the conversation that I want to have.
So when it comes to the conversation that you do want to have, I feel like that's probably heavily related to your work in Microsolidarity, which is meant to try and create many more Inspirals, which was, a very inspiring experience for you. So maybe, do you want to talk a bit more about Microsolidarity? During the Solarpunk event, when we met, you spoke about a couple of different like practical sort of like practices, I guess, that people can can pursue in their organizations to, I guess, to create microsolidarity?
Yeah, so I guess it's a theory, but it's a theory that's based on
Mm.
practice. Like it's based on experiences that I've had directly building communities and organizations, and with my wife Nati traveling a lot and working with organizations all over the world and trying to understand, like, how do you make a roadmap or how do you make a blueprint for something that needs to be adaptive and context specific? You know, like a community is something that's it's very complex and it's very adapted to its local place. So to try and come up with a recipe and say, oh, just follow these steps and then you'll experience belonging and trust and meaningful work and mutual exchange, like that's actually a kind of an absurd quest. Um, and so I've been on this mission of like trying to articulate what are some patterns or what are some repeatable experiences or like some things that you can do that will then generate a locally adapted context responsive system. And the two kind of headline or like fundamental pieces of theory that I've settled on so far, and I'm sure more will come in time, but the two I think of them as rhythm and scale sensitivity. So maybe the scale sensitivity is like really trying to drill it home to people that groups of different sizes are good for different things, and that some people will be familiar with Dunbar's number as a sort of like pop science idea that, oh, people can kind of know about 150 people or something like that. And what I'm really trying to drill home is actually there's Dunbar's numbers and it's plural, and the gist of it is like there's this progression of like about 5 people, then 15, then 50, then 150, 500, 1500. That there's these kind of thresholds that they at each of these different scales, the superorganism that's formed by those people becomes a different species. It's got different capacities, different competences, get different limitations. And so there's stuff that you can do with 5 people that you can't do with 50 and vice versa. And really trying to, which sound, I know in the abstract that sounds a little bit like a random insight, but it really, when you start to see these different thresholds and how they play out in organization, that really changes, I think, your approach to social change and to organizational design. So like one of the big takeaway lessons from me, and this applies to anyone both on the blockchain side and on the socialist side, like if you are proposing that capitalism sucks and things should be done differently, you should be able to prove at least some glimmers of what an alternative would look like at the scale of say 15 people or 150 people, and before you jump ahead and say like, well, when we completely transform all of society with its billions of people, like you should be able to prove some of those dynamics at a smaller scale. And what we find with like Solarpunk conferences, for example, usually when you get 15 or 50 people together, the kitchen's a mess, you know, and like how to keep the kitchen in a reasonable state of hygiene without excessively compromising people's freedom turns out to be a really sticky puzzle. And you could spend a decade working with different groups to try and come up with different recipes to solve that problem. And that would be a decade well spent, you know? Um, so that's one side, is like prove your argument at the small scale, or learn. It's not even just proving in the abstract. It's more like my experience of organizing with groups is that being in a really humming team, like in a collective that's really got a high sense of coherence and like collective intelligence, being a participant in one of those groups changes who I am. So it's not like I can stand outside of the group and then design, oh, this is going to be a new way of organizing. I actually become changed through the process of going through that organizational structure. And so that's why I've got this focus on the small scale thing. It's like really, yeah, get get your reps in at the small scale, and you'll find that your priority shift and your expectation shift about what's possible, what's desirable, all those sorts of things shift through the process of like actually starting to implement your values at small scale. So yeah, there's a whole dimension about scale, and then the other dimension is about rhythm, which is to say that often when you talk to someone about an organizational structure, like if I asked you to draw an organization, most people will draw a two-dimensional kind of organogram chart, and it's like either it's a pyramid because it's a hierarchy, or it's this like, if you're in crypto, you'll do these like kind of hexagons with lines between them because it's a network. And usually people's mental models around organizations are these like two-dimensional maps. And I'm proposing a different way of thinking about organizations, which is about time. It's really just prioritizing the temporal dimension. and that any like creative, decentralized, autonomous collective of people is going to be chaotic. That's just part of the territory. But you can help to like kind of stabilize that chaos a little bit by implementing these different rhythms. So knowing that every week we're going to have a beer and a pizza, and we're going to talk about what we did this week and like what we're going to do differently next week. Like that will do so much to stabilize a community project. Rather than like, if you don't have that kind of structure, what happens is tensions and frustrations just kind of have to simmer away quietly in the background until one of them breaks through and there's this big drama, and then you lose a few people in the community, or you have to spend hours and hours trying to repair the relationship. Like like rapid feedback loop of like hearing about small frustrations and turning them into practical changes. Like that's one ingredient that really is a huge leverage point, but in creating an organization that's actually fit for its local context. And there's longer term rhythms too, and there's more I can say about both of those. But that's kind of like a sort of tiny potted summary of some of the theory of microsolidarity. I think probably what's more interesting is the practice of it. So like, for me, one of the groups that I started was at the start of the pandemic. I was pretty freaked out. My wife Nati and I living in Italy, where we don't really have any friends and family, and suddenly, shortly after moving there, there's a lockdown, there's a global pandemic. It's like this uncertainty and fear. And one of the first things I did was get myself into a small support group so that at least I could have a video call with them once a week and kind of talk through what the shit are we facing here. And that having that in my life like really made the fear and uncertainty so much more manageable. Whereas if I was isolated, I think I would probably lose the plot a little bit. I'd probably wind up down some really weird rabbit holes, or
Right.
putting my head in the sand, or I don't know what. And it's that small scale, practical, kind of mundane, having someone to talk to.
Right.
That's the main activity of microsolidarity, is making sure everyone's got someone to talk to, someone to get good advice from, someone who's going to like encourage them to be more ambitious with their values, someone who's going to show them when they're remind me that my shit stinks, like having that just really high quality friendship. That's the main game that we're up to.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Like to me, I think that's like I think for some people, it may sound on the surface like very obvious. What's difficult about obvious things is doing them practically and like applying them in your life, actually. But I think that's interesting that you say that that it changes you whenever you take part in an organization that's like a well-oiled machine that can like that. I mean, you were saying it in the positive of like, being with high collective intelligence or something like, and in a positive way. But I've also thought about like, this is also true in the negative when you work for like a giant corporation and like you're really throwing yourself into it and like you're trying to move up the ladder. Like it changes you. It really does. And like you become a different person, if you are spending 10 years in, multinational corporation X, where you have to like to be a good cog in that machine, you have to be well oiled, you have to know where all the parts are, you have to know exactly where you can fit, you have to contort yourself into that shape in order to like to make the machine go faster. So that like I think this is just like a neutral conclusion to make that can be applied both. And I mean, it's a moral judgment on my end that one is negative and one is positive.
I mean, I share your moral judgment. I'm not afraid to say it. I think most organizations today are geared around a paradigm which, sometimes we call it the parent-child dynamic, where basically there's a few people in the organization which are the grown-ups, and they have responsibility and the final decision-making say, and they are super empowered. They're like super agents, and then everyone else are kind of like children, more or less. They're like children, and they have some agency, but they've got a bedtime. They've got a defined play area which they can't leave. They can't say naughty words. There's a kind of like there's some other grown-ups that have set the boundaries for their play, and that we, as a whole, like most people, are cast in the child role. And what we're proposing instead, and I think like the promise both of the blockchain and of the socialism, is that we can all be adults. That we can all have agency, that we can all show up and take responsibility and have rights. Both halves of that dynamic. And that the kind of organizations that I'm working with, the kind of collectives and communities and so on, are trying to change people to become more capable of exercising that agency and more like mutually responsible
and
to each other.
Like, to your point about socialism, like I think there is, like, living under capitalism, there's a certain like subject you become like used to living within capitalism, and you have certain expectations of others and like of your relationship to institutions, and it molds you in a certain way. I think if socialism is ever to exist, if it's ever going to be like a real like powerful thing, you have to know how to be the subject of socialism, which in my mind, I think it includes being someone who can be good at the skills that are required to create good organizations and good groups, and like harmoniously, and like to be able to work within groups and to know like what are appropriate expectations within groups, and like improve, like there's a certain mindset shift I think that's probably required in making socialism like something that will happen and stay. It means people have to be good at that.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. I love this idea that you kind of have to imagine that you already were living within the socialist context, and how would you behave in that context? Like, how would you show up, and start doing that now? Like, that's a different kind of framing of prefigurative politics, which I haven't quite heard before. And I'll come back to the dishes. I think I felt this struggle in myself at the Solarpunk unconference, that I want to be in a space where everyone is putting in a small amount of effort and it keeps the kitchen clean and there's no arguments about it and it's simple, right? And so I helped to set up a system, and it wasn't perfect, like there was lots of room for improvement, and we didn't really have an effective mechanism for like hearing about how things could be improved. And so by day 4 or 5, this kind of resignation creeped into me, where like in the first few days, I'm going to be an exemplary citizen. I'm going to do an extra load. I'm going to help. I'm going to be very encouraging and cajole people along to like keep the place clean. And at a certain point, I realized like, we haven't designed the system that's right. We haven't got the coordination problem hasn't been solved effectively. And now I've got a choice. Either I can just be resigned and be like, well, the system's not good enough. Things are not going to work. And so fuck it. Or I can show up as an adult and say like, yeah, the system is not going to be good enough. And that's what we're facing. But I can be a good contributor still. And I can still show up even though the system's not what I would like it to be. And I felt that in a conflict between me, like on a moment by moment basis, like, am I actually going to go the extra mile, or am I just going to put my hands up and say, well, it's not my problem, not my department? And I think it's that particular switch with the dishes, which is the same as any resources that we have to, any commons that we have to share as human beings. It's like we can sit and complain. And this is one of the things that traditional organizations really train you in, is this like powerless complaint, like to be like, oh yeah, it sucks, but it's not my problem. It's not my job. I wish it was different, but yeah, what can you do? And this kind of like completely impotent, grizzling, like that's a feature, not a bug, from the perspective of those institutions. Like they want you to just sit there grumbling and not doing anything about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi everyone, if you're enjoying this episode so far, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, share with a friend, and join the crypto leftist communities on Discord or Reddit, which you can find links to in the show notes. If you're enjoying the episode or find the content I make important, you can pitch into my efforts starting at $3 a month on patreon.com/theblockchainsocialist to help me out. As a patron, you'll get a shout out on an episode and access to bonus content like Q&A episodes where you can submit and vote on questions you'd like me to answer, and I'll give my thoughts in roughly 20 minutes. In the last bonus episode, I analyzed applying an anti-capture framework originally made for DAOs, but applied it towards left-wing organizing. Of course, I'll still be making free content like this interview to help spread the message that blockchain doesn't need to be used to further entrench capitalist exploitation if we put our efforts into it. So if that message resonates with you, I hope you'll consider helping out. Also, in case you didn't see it yet, I recently wrote a book review for Outland magazine on, no surprise, the network state, focused on Balaji's misunderstandings of the role of land and statecraft and his insistence to think of everything as a codebase, titled Fork Your Society, I Want Out. Additionally, I've written the piece under my real name, so I'm now officially doxxed. I can officially stop bleeping out whenever people say Josh, my name. It was time I came out of the Anon closet, since this is all in preparation for announcement for a book that I've been writing over the past year and a half titled Blockchain Radicals, but more on that in a later date. For now, let's get back to the interview. So thinking about like other types of resources, I'm curious, like within your Microsolidarity groups, what do the economic relations look like in these types of groups? Because I think that's one thing that I think is a huge, I mean, it's a problem for everyone. Like, how do we deal with money and like who deserves what as far as like gaining some profits or whatever. And yeah, this is definitely a huge awkward point for socialists. I think it's very awkward to talk about money in a socialist or like political context of any sort on the left. So I'm curious how you guys have kind of dealt with that.
Yeah. The kind of leftists that I've spent a lot of time with seem to have these kind of implicit rules. Like, it's completely fine to take money from academia. Like, if you can get paid to do research or to be a professor or something, that's cool. It's fine to take money from the state if there's like an unemployment scheme or something like that where you're going to get social welfare money. But then there's all these other kind of income streams which are not fine, and they're morally deficient, and there's something wrong with you if you take them. And these are kind of like unwritten rules about what's legitimate when you're trying to pay the rent. And I use leftists as an example, but every organization that I've been in where people are trying to implement a new way of working together, the questions around money tend to be some of the most polarized and charged and like conflict ridden. Because it seems to be a shortcut to some of our deepest psychological issues for some reason that we've encoded so much about, like someone who has a kind of leftist mindset but grew up with a lot of wealth. Often those people carrying a bunch of shame and like these confused emotions. Or on the flip side, someone who like me grew up with very little, has a bunch of shame about being a worthless person and like not really ever feeling like I've fully got, permission to be playing with the adults or whatever. Like, we've all got these like weird hang-ups. So that's one part of it, is we need to be able to like the reason I think that capitalism and this sort of individualistic approach to economics is so stable is because it allows us to keep our weird, awkward feelings around money private. And it's like, I've tried doing shared projects with people. Sometimes I've been on road trips with people where just the thing of like sharing the cost of the fuel or something turns into a drama. Like sometimes the smallest little experiment in shared economy can go really ugly. So I think there's a lot of, I think there are strong biases that are not purely political that push us towards this more individualistic mode. And on the other hand, like I described with my childhood, like I grew up in a religious community where there was a high degree of economic solidarity. And part of that was every member of the community, every family was contributing, if they could, they would contribute about 10% of their income to the church. And that money was used to like pay for the minister's family to live. It was paid to upkeep the community center, and it was paid to provide temporary support to people that had lost their income. And when I look at that now, I'm like, that feels like a utopia. Like, imagine getting a collective, imagine getting a socialist collective, and everyone's going to put 10% of their income and trust that it's going to be allocated in a sensible way and not be corrupted and not explode into constant conflicts. Like, that's quite incredible.
I mean, that's maybe like maybe a labor union is somewhat in that vein, but I think there is something to say that's maybe, I mean, for me, it's awkward because I was never like very religious growing up, but there's something to say for like, I don't know, Mormons also have like a huge amount of money because they all have this tithe that they pay. And sure, I may not agree with Mormonism and find some of the things like, detestable in some ways, but like that model itself is very successful, and like you can't say no to that.
Yeah. And the big question for me is like, can you decouple the metaphysics from the organizing structure? And I don't know. Know yet. Like, I think the evidence of the most successful communes and collectives over time have been organized around some kind of spiritual or religious metaphysics, and that's not really my jam. And so I'm like, can we inspire that level of solidarity without needing a God story? Maybe we need the God story. I'm not sure, or the guru story, or the like whatever. I would hope that we can. That we could have a vision that is basically a little bit more humanist, a little bit more materialist.
Mm.
But still, people can see it's in their self-interest to share some of their income with each other. So anyway, microsolidarity, like the long game is like I've experienced with Enspiral, where there is again a high degree of economic solidarity. Like we just did around, we have another tool, like in addition to Loomio, there's a tool called Co-Budget, which is a really nice system for collectives to allocate their budget democratically. We just ran a $20,000 co-budget round where it's like different members of the community have put money in this hat. We've got 20 grand. How are we going to spend it? And anyone in the community can make a proposal and say, oh, I want to do this training course, or I think we should have better childcare at our next gathering, or I'm going to rebuild our website, whatever, like anything that is either beneficial to the collective or even just beneficial to one person in the collective. Like anyone can put a proposal forward. And yeah, every couple of months we do a round like this where it's like, yeah, one of my friends, he just did a whole documentation project and wrote up a whole bunch of lessons that we've learned from Enspiral lately, and we can pay him for his time. That's an awesome way to collaborate, you know, like it's really, it makes a big difference to him and his livelihood. He lives cheaply, and so like getting a little chunk of change from the collective really makes a big difference. And the output's really valuable to all of us. And you know, if we wanted to, we could theoretically monetize that and turn it into an income stream eventually, whatever.
And that's not a crypto thing. That's not a blockchain thing. Like
it's not a blockchain thing.
Which is it.
It's not a blockchain thing.
Small comments, but I think it's interesting that some of these, I don't know when Co-Budget was created, but it feels like maybe it was during crypto stuff being built at the same time, which I don't know if this points to some kind of zeitgeist or I don't know.
Well, the first round was basically coexistent with Loomio, so like 2011, so pre-blockchain.
Right before.
But pretty early on in the blockchain swell, the people from Co-Budget were paying attention. It's just that when you're actually organizing on the ground communities, your priorities are different.
Yeah.
And the priorities for me, organizing at Enspiral, is can we collect this money in a way that's legal? You know, like that I can actually talk to the tax department and say, like, this is where the flows are, and this is the, you know, we're living up to our requirements and responsibilities. And that question just keeps getting bypassed from people that are experimenting with DAO ecosystems. One of the people who architected the Enspiral Foundation is Alana Irving, and she now works at Open Collective, which is my favorite, absolute world favorite software project in the world right now, because they're enabling tons and tons and tons of collectives around the world to collect and spend money in a transparent way that's legal. You know, that they can show up to their accountant at the end of the year and say, we did this, and the accountant says, that's fine. And they take away all of the headache of doing that, instead of having to do it in the black market, like 99% of crypto stuff is happening. So anyway, rant closed. What we found through, well, at least my very biased perspective on my experience at Enspiral, the money stuff goes a lot better when you have a sufficient degree of trust, belonging, you know, emotional solidarity. Then the financial solidarity goes very smoothly. And I think that's what's happening in the church as well, is that you have enough mutual investment in each other, in your lives as people, not as economic agents. Then being able to do these like shared financial projects is much more doable. And so the general roadmap of a micro-solidarity community is, don't even talk about money to start with. Start with, can you organize a book club once a week? You know, can we have a gathering where we get together in the summer and spend a weekend together? Like, can we just do some really, really basic level of how does scheduling work, and what kind of decision-making crises come up when we try to do, like, can we deal with those things first and start building that muscle? And as the collective organizing muscle gets stronger, then we start experimenting with money and say, like, oh, what would happen if we asked everyone to put in $20 a month into a shared fund? Like, oh, that's interesting. Suddenly there's a pool of money. What are we going to spend it on? Well, let's design ourselves some governance around that to make it, you know, the appropriate amount of freedom for people to allocate that, but also enough checks and balances and accountability, so we're not encouraging people to be corrupt. Like that the financial solidarity comes after the emotional solidarity. That's basically the plan. Okay. And there's a handful of communities that are experimenting with it, but it's mostly, I would say the majority of them at the moment are still just in that emotional layer, just in the like learning to be a group layer.
And so like these practices of micro-solidarity, I guess, help build that emotional solidarity so that the financial solidarity stuff is, yeah, I mean, ultimately it's downstream from all these other things. You have to build a base of mutual intelligibility and like understanding in order to get to the money part. Else money is sort of like a, okay, I think we usually think of money as being just like this very alienating like number that we just kind of like give to people or take away from people because of like XYZ reason. But I think that changes in groups that are much more, that are closer together. I think there's like, I don't know, like I'm definitely someone, like if I'm with a group of friends, I don't like to track, like everyone's expenses and then at the end, like pay everybody out. To me, it's like I don't know, it's like financializing friendships in a certain way or monetizing friendships. I like really prefer just like, all right, you can do that, I'll do this, and like we're probably relatively more or less we've paid somewhere around the same. Or if we know that one of our friends like doesn't have a job or like isn't, doesn't have nearly as much money, like why should we force them to pay in equal amounts? To me, it's like, I don't know, but I find that I'm usually in the minority in these type of things.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm in the same perspective as you. I mean, I think David Graeber did an amazing job of explaining this in his book about debt. Like that on the one hand, the best things about society are built from debt. They're built from mutual obligation. Like the sense that I owe you a favor is actually what brings out the best in us. Like that's where peace and goodness comes from. But the problem is when you quantify that obligation down to the decimal point, that brings out the worst in us. And it's this like crazy paradox. And it's easy to miss the point. But yeah, it feels so much more humane and life giving to me to be in a group where they can handle the money in an informal kind of sloppy way, knowing that actually that we've got enough trust between us that we don't need to like nickel and dime everyone. That feels so much better than someone. It feels like, I don't know, dealing with an accountant or dealing with an HR department
Yeah,
or
yeah.
something when you try and split every bill. Like, oh wait, no, you had the sparkling water which cost 50 cents more than the still water. Like,
Yeah, that stuff drives me insane. But so what I want to go to next is during the Solarpunk event, I presented on Breadchain and sort of gave like my vision and stuff on that. So we won't talk about that. But one of the things that I spoke about that we had an interesting conversation was that for me, kind of the ultimate problem that anybody on, if you want to consider yourself part of the left or like, anti-capitalist or whatever you want to call it, progressive, the two sort of really difficult, like the rock and the hard place that you're stuck in between is that you have to be both existing within capitalism while also trying to fight against it. And this is like an extremely, in my opinion, extremely difficult problem. Like this is like the biggest problem of the left, or it should be considered much more seriously. And like I think this framework is really nice, because like, yeah, you can as like what tends to happen, I think, sort of stereotypically is like, people get involved in political organizing, they go to different protests, they go to different events, and they say like, we're against this thing, we need to stop like this from happening. And then like they do that for a little bit and maybe it lasts for some time, but eventually like it dissipates. Either because of, I mean, there are of course potential like social reasons for why that problem, like political reasons or whatever, but also sometimes it's like people have just run out of money. Like we have like this issue that we need to all be, the working class needs to be like fighting against capitalism, while it also like at the moment the way that it exists is heavily dependent on capitalism, because that's how the system is designed. It's not because of like I don't know, it's not like a trick, it's like that's how it works. And we should be aware of that. But I think that sometimes that's kind of like lost in a lot of things. But I think a lot of the things that you've been talking about, I think fits really well with like trying to think about this problem. How do we be within and act against it?
yeah.
But yeah, I'm curious what you think about that framing.
Yeah, I think it's a good framing, and I don't have a straightforward answer, and I'm glad to think it through with you.
It's not a
Um,
straightforward question.
I mean,
Problem. Like,
yeah, Joshua Weil, who founded Enspiral, um, he his background is like he's a programmer and he's a businessman, and so he's
wow.
got that really kind of beautifully cold-hearted business logic in him. And he was on a pilgrimage and kind of had his like road to Damascus moment of like, wow, the world is really fucked up, and there's a lot of problems, and we need to get a lot more energy behind working on stuff that matters, as he describes it. And for him, stuff that matters is like environmental crisis, energy crisis, inequality in society, democratic crisis, like all of these important things need to have a lot of energy behind them, not just the against energy of like, you should stop being unjust and extracting all the world's resources, but the towards energy of like, and this is our alternative energy system and our alternative economic system. Like, we just need so many people to work on those things. And so his approach was like, how do we get more people working on stuff that matters? Well, I'm a programmer. I can earn a living from basically doing 1 or 2 days a week, which leaves me the rest of the week to do stuff that feels like more meaningful. So he just basically recruited people that had high earning potential to start with, and said like, okay, let's make a living in the smallest amount of time possible and spend the rest of our time doing useful stuff. And then the process since then has been to try and integrate those two halves. So like, can we earn a living and be doing useful stuff at the same time? You know, is it possible to do that? Sometimes for kicks, I introduce myself as a professional anarchist, because that's honestly what my job is. It's like, I go to organizations and I show them how to organize without domination hierarchies, and I get paid good money for it. And I feel great about that. You know, like I it's not like I'm getting paid so much money that I can just kick back and relax, but I'm getting paid enough that it feels like I've got choices. I can work in things that really sustain me ethically, you know, that give me a sense of purpose and meaning. And that I have choices about, like, right now I'm living in a van with my wife, and we can do that for a while. And if we wanted to do something else, we'll do something else. Like, I'm not trapped in the loop of poverty that I was for a long time. And that just feels like a good thing. And so like finding a path to integrate, like, what's my income and what's my values. Like, the closer that those two things can come together, I think it really liberates a lot of energy from people. I think if I get up in the morning and I have to work on something that feels either meaningless, like I think a lot of people have to work on stuff that they're like, yeah, it kind of sucks, but whatever. That's just what you got to do to earn a living. And then there's another group of people that are actively working on stuff that they despise. If those people were working on things that felt more meaningful to them, I think we'd get a lot more energy out of them, and they'd have a lot more free attention and creativity to be able to contribute to things that are really important. So it's a kind of, I mean, it's a radically moderate position, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think it's good for people to work on stuff that they think is important, and they should find a way to get paid for it.
Yeah.
It's such a moderate thing to say, but it is kind of radical. Like, how many anarchists, how many organizers with a radical politics that I know that feel like they have to just basically be living at the poverty line,
Right.
instead of doing what me and my friends at Enspiral are doing, which is that, okay, how do we just slightly repackage what we're doing in a way that people with money are willing to give it to us? Yeah, it just feels like it feels so much more fun doing it our way.
Yeah,
and it's not just about fun; it's about yeah, it's not just about the fun. It's about having a long-term, like you're saying, a long-term commitment to action. So not just like a temporary spurt of like, oh, there's a social movement currently underway, and I'm gonna like make some sacrifices for the next 6 months. So no, I want to commit my entire life to like leaning towards the future that I want to live in, and I want future generations to live in. I've got to it's up to me to kind of figure out how to earn a livelihood in that context. And I don't see a huge economic revolution coming in a hurry. And so, like, in the meantime, I mean, maybe we get the fully automated luxury space gay communism because of AI coming in the next few months. But if we don't, like, I want to have a strategy that doesn't completely destroy my soul, and gives me enough freedom to make choices and to have healthcare and, you know, like that. And again, it's not up to me being super clever and smart and competitive in the marketplace. It's me being in a network of people that are helping me get opportunities, helping me see my blind spots and my like psychological hangups around money, and helping me stay accountable to my values in the process. Because this is the real pitfall of the strategy, is like, oh yeah, I'm doing something that's meaningful. It just happens to be that I work for the oil companies. You know, like that, right. Kind of gradual disintegration of values that happens. That we need, I think we need accountability from our peers to like prevent that.
For sure. I think there is sometimes a fetishization of poverty by some on the left. I think it's just like a common stereotype that I think sometimes it is true, and sometimes it's just that they are people. I think people are attracted to the left sometimes because they are downwardly mobile. You have that sometimes as well, but indeed, like I think there is sometimes a moralistic component to it of like, oh, you make above X random income, therefore you are the enemy, even though like if that money were to be gone, then they probably would be in the same position as you are. So like they're working class, like that's the definition of it. But yeah, it's kind of like the problem that I found myself, and I don't know how much I should really talk about this, but I mean, I did this, like I started the whole podcast and everything while I was working full time at a different job, which is like probably not so like definitely not a leftist job like whatsoever. But it gave me like the money and the security to feel like very comfortable in being able to pursue the things and move towards a direction that I wanted to go in. So I mean, maybe I'm biased because of that, but I can only speak from my experience that I feel like I only lasted this long because of that. If I just like gave up everything, I'd be like, I'm going to go fully radical, like, I don't know, socialist blockchain stuff and like forget everything else. Like I would not have lasted a couple of months. Like no way.
I think there's actually points at a deeper issue about, I mean, it's kind of about dialectics in a way. Like before I met the people at Enspiral, my political consciousness was really, because of the Occupy experience, was really anti-capitalist, like really prioritizing the anti and thinking like there's bad people out there and we need to oppose them with everything we've got. And then maybe if we get enough people on our side, we'll run them over and then, then we'll be the good people. And I just don't see it that way anymore. It's more like, I just see it much more nuanced and gray and complex than that. And since I've stopped being so oppositional, I've found that there are people, that it's hard to describe, but like that the skills and the competence that I've got is actually valuable in the marketplace, and I don't have to sell out my values to get paid. But I couldn't see that when I was so committed to this position of opposition and saying like any organization that's got a budget of X dollars must be evil. It's like, nah, actually there's a lot of organizations out there that have massive budgets and they're doing something basically benign, and if I can help them be a little bit more effective, or I can help them to develop better communications and better relationships with them, and like that the staff are more empowered as a result, like that's a great contribution. I'm satisfied with it. And yeah, like I say, it buys my freedom to do things that are completely unaccountable to the marketplace, and awesome. And I maybe I'm being naive and maybe I'm misunderstanding the degree to which I'm privileged, but I think there's a lot of people that are, say for example, organizers, or like they're busy in collectives and they've got this kind of grassroots energy. Like they've got so many skills. Anyone who's got that kind of grassroots energy has got so many valuable skills that could be, that could, with the right packaging, generate a decent livelihood that feels really great. That is like ethical and contributing one little step towards the world we want to live in.
Yeah. Ironically, I think the people that tend to be stuck in this kind of like moralistic or like poverty cult kind of minded way of like doing activism or like trying to live a good life, I guess. Ironically, they're like just taking almost like the different side of the same coin of individualism, of like trying to solve the problem that, well, if I do this perfectly, then I'm doing my part to solve capitalism. What are you doing? Like you're not doing the. So it's like it's still to me like a hyper individualistic like frame of mind to be working in, which is like, I don't know, at least for me, I thought that was the thing that we're trying to prevent a little bit.
Yeah, this is maybe something worth highlighting. Like I mentioned, scale and the financial experiments we've done at Enspiral, like having something that's not individualistic, but it's also not global.
Right.
Like having this intermediate space. Enspiral is a bounded economy. There's like 200 people. And so within that group of 200, we can experiment with financial flows that there's no way I'd want to open up to a global population. But it's like a way of stepping out of my individualism and being less concerned with like, did I get exactly my ends met, or like, did I maximize the things coming my way? And I can afford to be more generous. So for example, like at Enspiral, we ask all the members to make some kind of financial contribution every month, and you can choose if you want to pay the small, the medium, or the large. And personally, I choose the medium, because I feel like, well, I'm probably a bit better off than the average, but nowhere near as well off as some of the people at the top end. So I'm going to contribute the medium. And this is just the mentality of like, to me, that's kind of a socialist mentality, like,
Mm.
oh, what do I have to give? Okay, I can give that much, and that
Right,
makes it easier
right.
for other people to give less. Like that I'm happy to do that in a bounded group, whereas I'd feel like a sucker if I was doing that at a global scale.
Right. Yeah, yeah, maybe yeah, sometimes I mean, not that this is like really a big issue, but sometimes there's like this implication that like paying taxes is socialist or something like that. That like being a good socialist means paying taxes, which is like absolutely like no, not the way that I think about it. But to your point, I think being aware of your position relative to like the bounded group is like a very it's like important it's an important piece of information to have in order to be an effective member of that group. Like rather than like it's never going to be that I mean like these kind of like caricatures of like socialism or communism, like where everyone gets paid the same or something, like everyone gets the same thing. It's about like recognizing what you have and what you don't have and being able to like play on your strengths towards the group. So like, yeah, I mean, being able to recognize that maybe you have a little bit more than others, maybe you should pay like the higher price tickets with as long as like within a group that you like trust and which you're a part of. And maybe part of the like, in order to reach that point, maybe organizations could have the structures in place or the I don't know the data dashboards maybe in order to know like where you
Yeah,
stand, like to
yeah,
create that collective intelligence. Like if you know like the average income of the group is X and your income is like X plus one, then like maybe you should pay a little bit higher. Like it like not that it has to be forced, but that like you're there is this like libertarian paternalism for you to pay the higher price.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a simple example, but I think it kind of illustrates what I've learned about building a business in a way that is trying to send us in a direction that's more socialist. So, for example, anything that I sell in my different business pursuits, there's always a small, medium, and a large price. We have different framings for that, but usually it's like, hey, if you're coming to this training or you're coming to this retreat or something like that, um, here's like the average income, the average salary for people in your area. And if you're like below that, take the small price. If you're a lot above that, take the high price. But it's up to you. You get to choose. And there's always some kind of avenue. Like if you're really excluded because of the financial barrier, fill in this form and we're going to make sure that we've got some seats available for people who can't pay. And even just like adding that level of just that extra little bit of complexity on the sales page instead of having like there's one price and you're in or you're out, but adding the pricing tiers plus like scholarship fund or something like that. Like I think it really does soften some of the worst aspects of capitalism and still mean that I can earn a livelihood that's sustainable and means that I can do it over the long haul. And so like these are some of the small innovations that you discover by doing it if you're not committed to hating money all the time.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like this. One of the things that I think is interesting is like thinking about this, the problem of like commodification, or like that in order to decommodify something, we can't really decommodify fully given the sort of like circumstances that we find ourselves in, but having kind of like these tiered pricing based on the kind of like solidaristic commitments that you have with others is maybe, I would think, like a little bit of a peeling back of the commodification onion that we are stuck in, maybe.
Yeah, yeah, and maybe there's another point here, which is slightly tangential, but the funnest game that I know how to play is that you can get a group of people together and collectively design a different kind
Mm.
of culture than what you inherited from sort of mainstream culture and from your family, and that culture can actually evolve over time. And so, like in the Enspiral community, I think that we have fused status and generosity. So like the way to be a high status person in that community is to give a lot, is to show up a lot, is to be like recognized as a good contributor. And that just feels so much more pleasant to be around than a community where status is fused to like material consumption or like who's the most intellectual,
really
or
expensive
whatever. You know, like
monkey JPEGs.
different communities have different. Yeah, look at my awesome monkey JPEG. Like, that just doesn't seem life-giving to me to be in that kind of community, and knowing that we can collectively design a different environment to be in, a different social context. Like, that's honestly just the most hilarious fun.
Nice. I think that was a great quote to end it on. Unless is there anything else that you really wanted to mention that we haven't talked about yet?
I could make a plug. We're going to have Microsolidarity summer camp, which is like a decentralized, I'm not in control of it. People from the community are running one summer camp in the northwest of the US and one in the west of Europe in the middle of July. So if anyone wants to come and hang out with community organizers that have got a different way of thinking about how we can support each other, go to microsolidarity.substack.com, and there's like a link there where you can pre-register you're interested in that. That's a little plug, but I think that's all I have to say.
Cool. And then did you want to leave where can people find you and your other work?
Yeah, probably the easiest to find me is if you go to richdecibels.com. I do a lot of writing on the internet. I'm very busy on Twitter, although I've recently started migrating over to Blue Sky because that seems cool. It's this new decentralized Twitter. But yeah, go to richdecibels.com. That's the kind of front door for all of my other projects. I have lots, but I'm not going to do a verbal version of it. Just go and check it out.
Listeners, go check it out. There's plenty of stuff. It is a rabbit hole to go into a lot of the things that you've been doing. So highly recommend it.
Oh, I have one more thing to say, if it's not too late. For the listeners, it's really important that when I first met Josh, I actually blushed and kind of stammered for a minute because I realized that Josh is actually a very handsome person. And I was expecting from someone with such a good radio voice that it wouldn't have a pleasant face. But I want to report to the audience that actually he's a very good looking fella.
And you're making me blush now. That's every time I talk to someone who like has listened to the podcast, they're always like, "Oh wow, you don't look anything like how I imagined." So yeah.
Yeah. There you go. You can put that on the outtakes reel.
Great way to end it.